Lift, gamma, and gain were designed to adjust Rec. 709 SDR media. These controls have served generations of colorists, but ultimately they're not really optimal for grading HDR. Premiere doesn't rely on lift, gamma, and gain for primary adjustments, because everything we've built was designed to work equally well in both SDR and HDR in any color space you can choose to work in. Instead, we've implemented a zone-based system that we think is easier to learn and is more flexible to use. I understand for a lot of people this is a significant change, but allow me to show you why I think you're really going to like it. When I talk about zone-based controls, I'm talking specifically about the color and contrast controls. These consist of contrast, exposure, temperature, balance, and saturation. And anyone who's used even Instagram's grading controls should immediately intuit what these do. The top controls map to the currently selected zone. So on the bottom, you can see a row of buttons. These buttons consist of the global controls, which is the first selected button, and a series of zone controls that are divided between shadow controls and highlight controls. We'll talk about these later on. The important thing to understand is that whenever you start grading any image using these controls, you always want to start using the global controls first. So, making sure that the global button is selected, any adjustment that I make to image contrast is going to impact the overall image. And so I can tweak the contrast, I can adjust the exposure. Maybe I want to roll those highlights back into the image a little bit. Maybe I want to warm this up even more or possibly cool it down. I think I want to go warmer. Color balance and temperature are very similar. Temperature lets you make very specific adjustments along the warm-cool axis, while tint lets you make specific adjustments along the plus green, minus green axis. I'm going to go back to adjusting temperature and warming things up. Whereas balance basically makes the same kind of adjustment, but allows you to go into any direction so that you can rebalance the color temperature at will. I'm going to reset that. Lastly, saturation allows you to make the intensity of colors diminish or increase. So far, so good. Nothing terribly different from any other color experience you've probably used. The key thing to bear in mind is that these controls automatically are adjusting the entire range of tonality within your image. So these are very much primary controls. Once you've made your overall global adjustments that make the image as good as it's going to look with those adjustments, that's when you switch to the more targeted zone controls in order to make little tweaks to specific regions of tonality that really need a little extra something. So for example, if we hover over these zone controls, we can see that different parts of the image become grayed out. The rule is, for any zone you hover over, the part of the image that's saturated is the part of the image that you're going to be adjusting with that zone. So in this case, if I decide, I want to go to those shadows, select the shadows controls, and then I'm going to raise those bottom shadows a little bit, I can use my exposure control, drag up, and now I am selectively adjusting just the shadows while leaving the highlights alone, and you can see that in the HUD. Conversely, if I want to go into the highlights and use my exposure control to drop those highlights to bring some of that cloud detail back in, I may do so without affecting what's down in the toe of the image, without affecting the shadows. So in a very real sense, the kinds of things that you would do with lift and gain, you may also do using the default 2 zone controls. Now, you can also add additional zones if you want for even more control. For example, something that you might end up doing with a gamma control, you can do by adding an additional highlight zone. So now the first highlight zone encompasses most of the highlights, but the next highlight zone up is specifically targeting the top highlights. And this done, I could now use this first highlight zone to actually boost those mid-tone highlights a little higher, and then I can use that top zone to dial those clouds back in and bring that detail. So in a very real way, when you use multiple zones together, you start to get into a situation where you're making curve adjustments, something that I talk about in another video. So anyway, the bottom line is zone controls let you scratch a lot of the same itches as lift, gamma, gain, except that they work beautifully with HDR, and you have more zones. regions. Lift, gamma, gain effectively gives you 3 regions of tonality to play with. You have up to 6 regions of tonality to play with using the color and contrast zone controls. That's a pretty big deal, in addition to the global adjustments that you've already made. The color and contrast controls work great in the direct Rec. 709 color setup of the color management, but they really shine if you change the color setup to wide gamut tone mapped. This has been recently improved, and I've gone ahead and reverted this project and switched to another clip because I want to show you the advantages here. So if I jump back into color mode, now when I start to make adjustments to contrast, I can really jam that contrast, and I have an automatic roll off around the highlights and the shadows, which are preventing me from clipping image detail unnecessarily. And I can really push things and get a very nice result. Additionally, if I go to exposure, I can now bump the exposure up or down, but because I'm not clipping those highlights and because I'm retaining detail down in the shadows, this exposure control is actually giving me some of the benefits that a traditional gamma control would in terms of letting me push those midtone values around, but it's doing so in a really nice, smooth, linear way. When you're using color and contrast within the wide gamut color setup system of color management, you get a lot of help from the color management system in terms of letting you make very smooth, very nice looking adjustments. And these also matter with zones. I've maximized image contrast in this image the way I want it, but let's just say I want to pick up those shadows a little bit. I can still use my shadow zones to open up those bottom shadows, but maybe, just maybe, I don't want that much shadow pickup. So I can add an additional shadow zone, which is a little more restrictive for just the things down at the bottom, down at the toe of the image. And now I'm just picking up those lower shadows. So having done all of this, let me show you what these same adjustments would have looked like if I go back into color management and I switch back to that direct 709 setup. I can still push my contrast around just as I did in wide gamut, but I end up with more clipping in the highlights and potentially clamping in the shadows, although I didn't really do much of that in this grade. And so it's pretty clear to see what the benefits of working in wide gamut are. The wide gamut color setup has been newly improved in the public beta, but it's still a work in progress. But I strongly encourage you to give the wide gamut color setup a whirl while you're getting used to color and contrast. I think you'll find you really enjoy the experience. Now, if you're brand new to color and you've never used any other system, I think you'll find that this is pretty quick to pick up. But on the other hand, if you're used to traditional lift, gamma, and gain controls, I won't lie, the zone-based controls can take a little getting used to. However, I think you'll find that they're extremely smooth, and the incredible flexibility you have in terms of how you can really target specific areas of the image that you want to adjust. And not just for exposure, but you can choose various highlights or shadow zones to do color temperature adjustments to. So in this case, I'm warming or cooling just those top highlights, or color balance, or saturation. All of these controls working together give you an enormous amount of flexibility that's really fast to use. Give it a try. I think you'll like it.